There's a moment in aviation history when the future arrived too early. A moment when engineers built something so advanced, so polished, so far ahead of its time that people meant to fly it hesitated. The Lockheed TriStar was that airplane. A wide-body built with technology the world had never seen. A machine that could land itself through fog, regulate its engines with machine precision, and fly with a calmness that felt almost unreal. Yet behind the cockpit door, pilots quietly asked the same uneasy question. Can I trust a jet that barely needs me? This is the story of that uneasy relationship. When the TriStar entered service in the early 1970s, it carried a feature so extraordinary that even rival manufacturers couldn't quite believe Lockheed had pulled it off. The jet could land itself, not assist, not help. It could perform a full approach, flare, touchdown, and rollout, all without the pilots touching the controls. In fog so thick that runways vanished behind a sheet of white, the TriStar could settle onto concrete with a precision that bordered on eerie. To engineers, it was a miracle. To regulators, it was a breakthrough. But for many pilots, it felt like a quiet threat. Landing wasn't just part of the job, it was the part of the job. It was the moment where training, instinct, and judgment blended into one decisive action. Pilots learned to read subtle cues, the rumble of crosswinds, the tone of the engines, the feel of the yoke softening just before touchdown. These sensations formed an invisible dialogue between pilot and machine. In the TriStar, that familiar back and forth simply wasn't there anymore. In training sessions, instructors would demonstrate Autoland by asking pilots to fold their arms and simply watch. The first time the airplane flared on its own, some pilots described a feeling of being pushed out of their own profession. The TriStar didn't hunt for the runway, it didn't correct with visible effort. It glided down as if it already knew the answer to every question a pilot might ask. That smoothness was precisely the problem. The yoke barely moved, the throttle slid with mechanical gentleness. The airplane simply didn't show you its effort. Pilots weren't used to trusting something they couldn't feel reacting. In a world where cockpit authority was rooted in hands-on control, the TriStar changed the rules too quickly. Suddenly, the machine wasn't assisting the pilot, it was outperforming them in the one maneuver where pride, identity, and human skill mattered most. Autoland wasn't unsafe, it was simply early. Too early for pilots who had built careers on instinct, not algorithms. Did you know, in its early years, the TriStar performed more fully certified automatic landings than every other wide-body of its era, because it was the only airliner capable of a complete Cat 3 approach. And that discomfort didn't stay philosophical. Soon, an accident would bring every simmering doubt to the surface. On a quiet night in December 1972, Eastern Airlines Flight 401 lined up for its final approach into Miami. The TriStar was only 2 years old and still considered one of the safest wide-bodies ever built. But that night, something unsettling happened, not because of a technical failure, but because of a tiny, almost laughable small distraction. A single green light bulb on the landing gear panel didn't light. The gear was actually down and locked, everything was normal, but the cockpit crew became fixated on the missing light, convinced something was wrong. They pulled the bulb, reinserted it, jiggled it, debated it. The autopilot held the airplane steady, right up until a small, unnoticed change in mode shifted everything. With one unintentional nudge of the control wheel, the autopilot slipped from altitude hold into control wheel steering, a mode that allowed the aircraft to descend gently without any warning chime. The airplane started to sink. No alarms and no caution lights, just a steady, silent drop into the darkness. The crew noticed far too late. The TriStar hit the Everglades with devastating force. The NTSB concluded the truth calmly and unemotionally. The airplane had worked perfectly. The crew simply didn't notice they were descending. It was human error intensified by distraction. But perception doesn't follow logic, and in cockpits around the world, pilots whispered something very different. They said the TriStar's automation was just too quiet. They said the autopilot changed modes without enough feedback. They said the aircraft felt emotionally disconnected from the crew. That crash left a mark that numbers alone couldn't erase. Even though the TriStar wasn't responsible, it instantly became associated with the haunting idea that it could slip away from the pilots without them noticing. Then came the ghost stories. Bizarre tales of Flight 401's dead crew supposedly appearing on later flights. Completely untrue, but psychologically powerful. In the public record, Flight 401 was a tragedy rooted in distraction. In the minds of pilots, it was something deeper, proof that automation could betray them quietly, without warning. And after that night, trust in the TriStar was never quite the same. Pilots used to say the DC-10 felt like a real airplane. You pushed the throttles and the airplane surged. You felt the weight shift on landing, heard the hydraulics grunt, sensed the strain of metal and airflow working together. It was imperfect, but it was honest. It let pilots feel like pilots. Then there was the TriStar. Its cockpit belonged to a different philosophy entirely. Lockheed believed the future of flying should be quiet, smooth, and nearly effortless. Vibrations were dampened and even the engine harmonics felt muted. The flight controls felt light, almost clinical. Inside the cockpit, it was as if someone had taken the emotional texture of flying and polished it out. Pilots who transitioned from older jets described the TriStar as a machine that didn't want to show you what it was thinking, and that lack of tactile feedback created a tension no manual ever addressed. You didn't feel the gear struts settle, you didn't sense the minor buffet of crosswinds, you barely noticed power changes during approach. Some pilots found this futuristic, others found it unsettling, because flying is built around intuition. You interpret the airplane through sensations as much as through numbers, and when the sensations fade, it becomes harder to anticipate what the airplane will do next. Even small things added to the disconnect. The TriStar's digital readouts replaced dozens of analog gauges pilots were used to scanning at a glance. Instead of dancing needles, the cockpit now spoke through calm, unwavering numbers. Engineers celebrated this as clarity. Pilots saw this as distance, another layer between human instinct and machine behavior. One crew member said the TriStar was so smooth that it hit the edges of flight. You didn't sense the atmosphere the way you would in a 707 or DC-10. You sensed the aircraft's interpretation of the atmosphere. And that raised a deeper question among pilots. If the airplane filters everything, how much am I really flying? For pilots who had learned to trust their senses more than their screens, that question lingered longer than anyone expected. The TriStar flew beautifully, almost too beautifully. In an era when pilots still defined themselves through physical connection to their aircraft, the TriStar's elegance felt like emotional detachment. It wasn't untrustworthy, but it didn't feel alive, and that subtle absence mattered. If aviation were decided by engineering alone, the TriStar would have dominated the skies. But airlines don't live in a world where the best design always wins. They live in a world shaped by scheduling, maintenance budgets, training hours, and the simple habits of the people who keep planes moving. That is where the McDonnell Douglas DC-10 took the lead long before passengers ever stepped inside either jet. The DC-10 reached the market first, and that single advantage shaped everything that followed. Airlines started building their operations around it. They trained their crews on it, stocked their maintenance hangars with the parts it needed, and organized their schedules around its capabilities. Once an airline sets up everything around a type, switching to another feels like tearing out walls while the house is occupied. By the time the TriStar arrived, the DC-10 had already become the aircraft many airliners were committed to. The odd part is that the DC-10 struggled early on. It faced mechanical problems, headline-making accidents, and plenty of criticism from regulators. The TriStar, by comparison, had one of the strongest safety records of any wide-body jet of its era. But airlines weren't lining up to compare statistics. They were choosing the option that created fewer internal headaches. Pilots often leaned towards the DC-10 as well. Some liked how it handled. Others felt comfortable with its cockpit layout because it followed the same logic they had grown up with. The TriStar introduced new systems and new habits that required time and patience to learn. In an industry where training costs pile up quickly, that alone was enough to push many airlines away from it. Then came the blow the TriStar never fully recovered from. Rolls-Royce entered financial collapse during development of the RB211 engine, and the TriStar could not fly without it. The delay stretched into years, and while Lockheed waited, the DC-10 reached customers, entered service, and began building its reputation simply by being available. By the time Lockheed returned to the market, the momentum had already shifted. Airlines were comfortable with the DC-10. They had spare parts, trained crews, and a rhythm built around it. Switching to the TriStar would have meant resetting the entire ecosystem. Many airlines simply chose not to start over. The TriStar simply lost because it showed up late to a race where everyone else was already moving. Familiarity won, and sometimes in aviation, that matters more than having the better aircraft on paper. By the time the TriStar reached its operational maturity in the 1980s, pilots who flew it regularly described it as one of the best handling wide bodies ever built. It was quiet, stable in rough air, and remarkably reliable. Dispatch rates were excellent. Engine performance was strong. Systems integration was years ahead of anything Boeing or McDonnell Douglas fielded at the time. But reputations form early, and the TriStars had already solidified. Flight 401 haunted its image, not the fact of investigation, the myths. Ghost stories circulated through crew rooms with a kind of folklore persistence. Then came the whispers that the TriStar thought for itself. Some pilots joked that it could land without them noticing. Others avoided Autoland entirely unless the weather absolutely required it. Even after pilots learned to appreciate its gentleness, the initial tension never fully faded. The TriStar was always talked about as the aircraft that was too smart, too smooth, or too quiet. Compliments on paper, but loaded with unease in pilot culture. The public never understood this divide because passengers adored the TriStar. It had one of the quietest cabins in the sky. Its takeoff roll felt refined. Its ride quality was luxurious. To the flying public, it seemed like the future. But inside cockpits, where myths and memories last longer than facts, the TriStar carried a faint aura of mistrust. Not because it was flawed, but because it never aligned with the instincts of the generation who flew it first. Lockheed eventually withdrew from commercial aviation altogether, not because the TriStar failed, it didn't, but because the company had poured everything into an airplane the pilots never completely embraced and airlines never fully committed to. The TriStar wasn't misunderstood by engineers, it was misunderstood by people, and aviation is still a human business. Did you know, by the end of its career, the TriStar held one of the best safety records of any wide-body airliner ever built, yet many pilots still felt more comfortable in older, noisier jets simply because those machines gave them more physical feedback. By the time pilots grew comfortable with the TriStar's capabilities, one final tension remained. Not about what the airplane could do, but about what it chose to reveal. Modern crews call it automation transparency. The TriStar arrived before the concept even existed, and the gap between what the airplane did and what the pilots felt became a quiet source of mistrust that never truly went away. The TriStar carried a philosophy that was decades ahead of its time. Automation should blend into the background, working silently unless something important needed attention. It filtered turbulence, smoothed thrust changes, trimmed itself with the finesse of a watchmaker, and shifted flight modes without any drama. Lockheed believed this would reduce pilot workload, and technically it did. But something else happened too. The airplane became harder to read. Older jets communicated through sound and motion. A pilot could sense when the engine spooled, feel when the trim changed, hear the hydraulics adjust. Even the imperfections, the shudders, the hums, the mechanical resistance told pilots what the airplane was thinking. The DC-10, the 747, even the aging 707 all had their own vocabulary of rattles and cues. You always knew when the airplane was about to ask something of you. The TriStar erased that vocabulary. Its automation didn't announce itself. It acted, quietly and very smoothly. But in the cockpit, where trust is built on feedback, silence can feel almost like secrecy. Pilots began describing the TriStar not merely as smooth, but as opaque. You didn't always know why it trimmed itself, or why the autothrottle made a correction. And when the flight director slipped into one of its blended modes, it could feel subtly different without explanation. The airplane had everything under control, but the pilots didn't always feel looped into what it was thinking. One captain put it best years later: "The TriStar never scared me, it just never felt like it wanted to let me in." For a lot of pilots, that was the real issue. You understood what the airplane was doing, but you didn't always feel it. The quiet, the smoothness, the lack of small cues, it all created a kind of distance. You were flying it, but you weren't connected to it in a way older jets taught you to be. The TriStar remains one of aviation's greatest paradoxes, a jet that did almost everything right, yet never won the confidence of the people at the controls. It was elegant, advanced, and remarkably safe, but trust doesn't come from statistics. It comes from instinct, from that quiet understanding between a pilot and the airplane. So here's the question. In a world moving towards fully automated flight, do you want the future in control or a pilot's hands on the yoke? Let us know in the comments, and if you love unraveling stories like this, hit that like button and subscribe for more mysteries from the skies.